Hello, and thank you for joining us for the July installment of the International Leadership Association's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. I am Ashley Woolham, Coordinator of Member Services and Marketing at the ILA, and I will moderate this webinar with Richard Boyatzis. Before we begin, please note the following. First, within 24 hours of the session, you may find an audio-visual recording of this presentation in ILA's webinar archive. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second portion of this webinar. Finally, 4 randomly selected participants of today's webinar will win a complimentary copy of Resonant Leadership, written by Richard Boyatzis and Annie McKee. I will announce these winners at the end of today's session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Richard Boyatzis is Distinguished University Professor and a Professor in the Departments of Organizational Behavior, Psychology, and Cognitive Science at Case Western Reserve University and Human Resources at ESOD. Using his intentional change theory and complexity theory, he continues to research sustained, desired change at all levels of human endeavor, from individuals, teams, organizations, communities, countries, and global change. He's the author of more than 150 articles on leadership, competencies, emotional intelligence, competency and development, coaching, and management education. Since 2000, his articles on coaching have included longitudinal studies and now fMRI studies of coaching effectiveness. His books include The Competent Manager, the international bestseller Primal Leadership with Daniel Goleman and Annie McKee, Resonant Leadership with Annie McKee, and Becoming a Resonant Leader with Annie McKee and Fran Johnston. Professor Boyatzis has a BS in Aeronautics and Astronautics from MIT and a MS and PhD in Social Psychology from Harvard University. Welcome, Richard, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you, Ashley, and all my friends out there. Today I'm going to speak to the issue of how do we help people inspire change, but not just any kind of change. How do we inspire sustained desired change? What does this directly have to do with leadership? Well, coaching has 3 important aspects that directly affect a person's leadership effectiveness. First, it is a key vehicle by which we can help to inspire and develop new leaders or people to reinforce or enhance their leadership. Secondly, as we showed in an article a few years ago, neuroendocrine processes engaged when you are coaching with compassion, which I call, and I'll explain, coaching to the positive emotional attractor. One of the major benefits is that the person who is the coach experiences a neurological and endocrine set of processes that help a person reverse the effects of stress and rebuild themselves, what we called renewing in our 2005 book. Third, one of the things that people in leadership roles need to do all the time is to create a climate in which people feel engaged, committed, adaptive, and are bringing issues and possibilities to others. This is what I would call a positive emotional attractor climate. So for those reasons, I would contend that learning to coach and coaching effectively, which I would use the shorthand coaching with compassion, is at the heart of helping leaders sustain themselves, helping other people become leaders, and creating a climate in which leaders will emerge. One of the things that we need to do is just to touch base a little bit before we start to talk about how do you develop new leaders. And let me ask you a question. Excuse me, let's try an exercise. One of the reasons I have to do this exercise is that about 60 years of research in social psychology reminds us that people don't get convinced of things by rational arguments. They get convinced through emotional arguments, and then you use rational arguments afterwards to make yourself feel better. So I can't just contend what an effective leader looks like or how he or she acts or makes other people feel. So I'd like to have you do a little bit of that. Think of a leader for whom or with whom you worked that brought out the best in you, someone you would eagerly seek out working with again. And it's best if you think of a specific individual to be able to do this. Secondly, think of a leader for whom or with whom you worked who you try to avoid, who did not bring out the best in you, who left you wishing for more and would help your competitor more than would help your organization. As you think of these two specific people, think of what each of them did. What did they typically say or do? How did they make you and other people feel? I'm going to go silent for about 10 seconds and let you reflect on that a little bit. Maybe jot down some notes. While you still may be jotting notes, let me open up the discussion part of this and ask you to type in the place where it says to provide questions. What I'd actually like you to type in is not a question as much as some of the descriptors you came up with. So let's start with the person that you first thought of, the leader who brought out the best in you. Why don't you, I'd appreciate if you could type into the box, what are some of the ways he or she acted? What did they say or do? How did they make you and other people around them feel? Again, the person who brought out the best in you. Okay, so they were principled. They, sorry, the box is very small here, so I need to read it slowly. They believed in you more than anybody else at the time. They made you feel empowered. They were very encouraging and provided opportunities for growth. They were very kind as well as encouraging. They listened without judgment. They inspired you. One person whose name I can't quite make out said they needed you. It could be Cheryl. I'm not sure what you meant by that. They saw your talents and gifts. They empowered you through a variety of tools and resources. Again, they were encouraging. They allowed you to make mistakes. They were patient, available to respond to questions, and encouraged you to take risks. Several of you have said that. Again, listen comes up a number of times. They solicited and asked for your opinion on things. They were genuinely interested in your ideas. They made you feel inspired, authentic. They made you think. They admitted their own mistakes. They listened and expressed confidence in you. That's a very good list. Let's shift to the other person. Why don't you start to describe the person who did not bring out the best in you? What were they like? How did they act? How did they make you and other people around them feel? Again, if you could type in some of your answers, I'd appreciate it. Sorry, you're probably hearing my mouse click. The box on this this kind of web platform is minuscule, so I can only look at one phrase at a time. So again, I'm asking you to describe the person who did not bring out the best in you. How did they act? What did they say or do? How did they make you and other people feel? You could type in some of your responses. I would appreciate it. Okay, so various of you are saying, and I'll just start to read a bunch of them. They micromanaged. They created a sense of fear. They asked me to do things that they wanted me to do. They took the credit but attributed the blame. They were negative. They were hostile. They were narrow-minded. Oh, this is a good one. They made me feel like a human resource, a cog. They were very focused on the objectives and the goals. They didn't really care about me. They asked me to conform to their views. They were critical, hostile, detailed, perfectionist. Excellent set of observations. Let's step back for a moment and look at the theme of what you just talked about with these. And what I would say is, look at what you were just saying about these people. The person who brought out the best in you, engaged you, empowered you, inspired you, involved you, gave you a chance to take risks, listened to you, valued you, cared about you. The person who did not created distance, was narrow, negative, hostile, if not threatening, and very self-centered. So it brings us to a very important observation, which is that leadership is a relationship. I know this sounds like duh, but you really can't be a leader without followers. So it is far more important for us to focus on the nature of the relationship between the leader and the people around him or her than for us just to focus on the leader. And very often that minor deception ends up getting in the way. But of course, it's not just any type of relationship. The people who brought out the best in you, which is a very good measure of whether or not a leader is activating your talent and resource for the organization or not, is that they were interacting with you. And they were interacting with you in an engaging way, in contrast to the other person who was creating more distance. For our 2002 book, Primal Leadership, we described this as a resonant relationship, borrowing the term from physics. Or quite simply, in contrast to the metaphor you often see mentioned in management texts and people talking, especially in the past, is that it is not a top-down relationship. It is not that the person in the key role of a leader comes up with the values, the strategy, and then tells everybody else to align behind them and follow them. The concept of resonance gives us a more engaging description that seems to be more accurate with the empirical results, which is that effective leaders seem to be in tune or in touch with the people around them. They're in sync. They're on the same wavelength as others. The behaviors that we saw, of course, are behaviors that in this day and age we would often call emotional and social intelligence. Doesn't mean people don't need to be smart. Of course they do, but they need more than that. And if we look at some of the characteristics of people who form these resonant relationships in the research, what we end up discovering, and this is really an argument we made in the 2005 book, is that we often find that they inspire us through creating a context. And that's really what vision is. They remind us of the purpose of the organization. They don't just focus on the measures, which are important, but the measures tell us how well we're doing. The vision tells us why we're doing anything, why we exist. And often that's done in a way in which we feel lifted by it. It is more noble. It creates a sense of hope and efficacy about the possibilities. As several of you said, they care about us. They don't just understand you. It's not just empathy. They actually care. And we use a term, compassion, really coming out of more Confucian thought than anything else, where you're opening yourself up to others, not just feeling for those in pain. And they are mindful. Now, very often in mindfulness doesn't come out. It's a jargony phrase in psychology and Buddhist thought. Excuse me. But today, what we would use in the vernacular was we would say, oh, that person's really genuine, or they're very authentic. Sometimes we use the term integrity. What we're trying to capture by that is saying that there's an internal consistency or congruence that the person has between their thoughts, their feelings, their values, and there is a consistency and a congruence in those values and their behavior and in the way they act in many contexts. All of this comes together and leads us to conspire the fact that they inspire us by creating and maintaining these resonant relationships. So we didn't really need this opening few minutes of the talk, but I felt it was important that at least we anchor a little bit of the content of what would we want to be inspiring people to be able to do if we were to try to be more effective leaders. How do we know this resonant versus dissonant leadership really works? Well, among other things, we finished a number of months ago an fMRI study in which we got average age 49 people to identify specific moments with resonant leaders in their life and dissonant leaders in their life, and then we read back to them statements that they had made about each of those resonant and dissonant leaders while they were under a functional magnetic resonance machine, so we could actually look at what neural networks were being activated. And this article is going to be coming out in the Leadership Quarterly. But one of the results, in a nutshell, and this is just a preliminary study, small sample size, as they are with these kinds of studies, and we did it with staff, faculty and staff here at Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Clinic. But what we were able to document is that when people recalled moments with resonant leaders, part of the neural networks activated are ones that are called mirror neuron systems. These are things that allow us to link to others and to be able to mirror or mimic their behavior, and even with some other parts of the hemodynamic response, quite possibly interpret their intention or the emotions involved in it. These moments with resonant leaders activated what's called the social or the default mode network, which allows a person to be open to new ideas and possibilities. And in the response to the dissonant leaders, many of these systems were deactivated, which means they were being suppressed. Largely what we found with the deactivation or the dissonant leader moments is that people basically wanted to avoid even thinking about them. Again, just a preliminary study, but one that gives you a sense about what we're showing. And here's a slide, just one result that shows the arousal of the inferior frontal gyrus. I'm assuming you can see my pointer on my mouse. So these two zones, those are the zones, a key part of the social network that helps to modulate the gap or the events between certain cognitive demands and emotional and social demands. And this was strongly activated by memories of the resonant leaders, not the dissonant leaders. Okay, so all of that was done for this purpose, to focus in on, again, helping you understand, starting from an emotional as well as intellectual point of view, how do people help you. So for this exercise, I do think you should get a piece of paper out, because I'm going to ask you to take a few notes and then share a few of these observations. So first, think of several people, and I'd like you to think of 1 to 3 of them if possible, who have helped you the most in your life. Think big. Don't think just about work. Think about your whole life. And as you think about your life and your career, answer the question, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for person X. I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for person Y. And think of 1, 2, or 3 people who have, in this sense, helped you the most in your life and career. Write their name down. I'm not going to ask you to tell me their name, but I will be interested in how they acted. We'll get to that in a moment. So I'll just give you, again, a few moments of silence that you can write. Now what I'd like you to do is, next to each person's name, remember a key moment you had with them, a moment in which you learned or got something. What I'd like you to do right now is, in remembering one of those moments, very often you had a number of them, let your mind sort through them and pick one that jumps into your memory. In that moment, what did the person say or do? How did it make you feel? And then, what did you learn or take away from it in retrospect as you reflected on it later? Again, I'll go silent for about 15 seconds this time, and then I'll ask you to share some of those observations. But first, why don't I let you take some notes?
And Richard, sorry for interrupting, but while folks are writing, I wanted to share that in the questions pane, next to the X, there's an icon with an arrow that you can use to enlarge that part of your screen, and it'll be easier to read responses.
See that? Where?
It's next to the X.
Where? I just did it. Nothing happened.
It looks like part of a square with an arrow.
Yes.
And when you click that, it should pop out.
No.
Okay, let me see
it
what
pops out to a different part of the screen, but it doesn't get in.
Well, and then you can click on a corner and drag it open.
Click on a corner.
Sorry, you can click on, for example, the bottom right corner of the questions box, and you can drag it so it's larger.
Oh, I see. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
That's going to help me a lot. Great. I appreciate that.
Of course.
I see there's a whole set of these that I didn't see before. Okay, could you click me back on and let me... Okay, thank you. I appreciate you working on your own. What I'd like to ask you to do now, in the same way you were typing in some of the answers about the person who brought the best you versus the person who did not, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to type in a few words or phrases about this moment when this person helped you the most. What were they saying or doing? And as you type it in, I'll read it or paraphrase it to the rest of the group. Okay, this person said, this person made you feel important, like you counted, and related personal triumphs and hardships. Another person, they were very encouraging, logical, supportive, had your best interest in mind. They challenged me, guided me to find solutions rather than giving up, rather than having them give me the answers. Stacy, you said it was parents, professors, they worked hard and perseverance. Allison, guiding you, making you think. Steve, making you feel you weren't an idiot. That's precise. Teresa, they trusted your intuition. Thomas, they were modeling inspiring behavior. Tony, that you felt connected and cared for. Deborah, they set the bar high and let you know that you had the ability to reach. Tim, they were encouraging while showing you that how you had not done your best. John, they made complex simple. Joe, they reviewed a project you designed and shared it with senior leaders. Robert, they gave you full acceptance. And Melanie, they were standing and representing your greatness, they were saying. Lisa, they told you could accomplish much more than you had even thought possible. Jennifer, they gave you time to think about the responses as opposed to just giving you some trite answers. Kristen, they were very clear and direct, but calm and encouraging. Thomas, they were asking questions, listening, and helped you to remember what your aspirations and dreams were. Christina, even though you were filled with doubt, they confidently, in quotes, handed my dreams back to me with encouragement. That's a beautiful phrase. Sarah, they were listening and challenging your questions, push you to greater understanding. Kurt, give you responsibility of trust, appreciation. They were intentional. Aaron, mentoring conversations, helping you work through and think through goals and opportunities. Allison, they instilled confidence. Oops, sorry, I got a little confused by these. Lists are coming in very fast. Joe, they expanded the scope of work to help you reach new audiences. John, they made you believe you were creative. Melissa, they asked you to select the best options. Christina, they told you an inspirational story about it when they were a small child, and you feel connected in time. Tammy, they were encouraging and linking you to the right people. John, they saw alignment between your strengths and the opportunities. Joe, they seemed to truly like you as a person. Okay, so now let me ask you a more elaborate question. Now, I don't want you to describe them. Now what I'd like you to do is to describe how you were feeling right now when you were remembering those moments. As you were doing this recollection of these moments with these people, what were you aware of feeling right now? Appreciative, safe, confident, grateful, in tears, grateful, blessed, grateful, capable, warm, strong, empowered, confident, a sense of empowerment, appreciated, a bit sad because you missed that, confident, lucky, grateful, angry, important, thankful, gratitude, renewed, loved, capable, efficient, energized, aware, admiration, top of my game, challenged, supported, competent, acknowledged, empowered, motivated, worthy, warm, special, grateful. Thank you. Valued. This is a very powerful list. Most of the time, when people start to do this exercise, they say most of these same things. And one of the first feelings that come back to them is, wow, somebody cared for me that much. Somebody loved me that much. Somebody appreciated me that much. And I feel a deep sense of gratitude, of pride, of love. And yes, sometimes it makes me a little teary, especially if I think of how I've lost those moments or the person has passed away, and I feel very sad or nostalgic about it. People also sometimes report an odd paradox of feeling like you're helicoptering, and although you're watching this scene that occurred 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it comes back with amazing clarity, and you feel calm about watching it, and yet you're caught up in it as if it was happening yesterday, so you're feeling excited. I would like to point out that if you had any of that range of feelings, as many of you did, that you just had an experience of the parasympathetic nervous system. So one of the objectives I talked about in terms of the benefit of coaching others, you just had, which is a moment of, in shorthand, a renewal moment. And I'll explain what that means in a second. Let me pose to you, though, the question that is perhaps the most important one of this webinar, although we won't spend much time analyzing it, but I would like you to think about it later. Whose list will you be on? Whose list will you be on? Okay, so now let's start to see if we can make sense of what actually is going on and what you started to describe. The first thing I'd like to say is that since 1967, when I made the jump from the aerospace field, I was working in research on spaceships at the time, literally, into psychology. It was through work that Dave Kolb was doing at then the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and we started working on an earlier version of this model, and I've continued working on it for most of my career. But what all of these longitudinal studies we did, first at MIT in the late 60s, then I did with alcoholics and drug addicts in the 70s, and then since I've been here at CASE in 87, we've done over 24 longitudinal studies of 25 to 65-year-olds looking at how people sustainably change and improve their competencies, emotional, social, and cognitive intelligence competencies. And what becomes very clear from all of those studies is that when people develop in a sustainable way, they develop through what in complexity theory is called a series of moments of discovery or emergence. And that these moments of emergence or discoveries always fit a pattern in those people who sustainably change. The first is the discovery of some vision, some sense of who you would like to be, some sense of your core values, some sense of a purpose or a possibility for the future. If you have that, you're eligible for the second. If you don't, you actually are not on a path of change or sustained desired change. If you have some sense of vision, the second discovery is very often how you're coming across to others, which I call the real self, and the instantaneous comparison to the ideal, which generates a personal balance sheet, the sense of strengths and weaknesses. If you have that some sense of personal balance sheet, you're eligible for the third discovery, which is a learning agenda. This is not, by the way, a performance improvement plan, and I'll explain in a moment. The fourth discovery is actually engaging in the metamorphosis, the experimentation and practice. And the fifth is establishing these trusting resonant relationships that enable you to go through all the rest of them. What I contend, and we've been showing since 2001 that we've been doing this exercises here at Case Western Reserve University in our coaching workshops, is that 80 to 100% of all of the moments that people remember had somebody engaging you in considering a possibility for the future, what I would call engaging your personal vision or ideal self, or endorsing your strengths. So many of you probably thought of your mother or father, grandmother, grandfather, and some conversation you had with them in which they asked you about a possibility. They got you to consider something that you hadn't thought of for the future, something you could be, something you could become. Could have been an aunt or an uncle, could have been a teacher, coach, professor, early manager, could be a spouse or partner. Or in a certain moment, they really believed in you. They gave you a responsibility for something you thought was over your head. They really endorsed your strengths. Now, why is this so important? It's because I would contend that this helps us to understand why so often when we try to help people change, we fail at it. Because in these workshops where we have 4 days to work with people and we have plenty of time to work on these moments, we find that 67% of the incidents people remember when they answer a different question, which is, tell me about anybody who's tried to help you in the last 2 years. Teacher, coach, trainer, manager doing a performance review. 67% of the time, people come back and say those were moments in which they gave me data about how I was coming across, this real self. And then they said, okay, let's focus on your gaps. Let's focus on where your ideal self and your real self are not together. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why I think most of the time people don't change as a result of the work we do. Inside of each person, again, drawing on complexity theory, I think there's a positive and negative emotional attractor. The positive emotional attractor is being in a parasympathetic nervous system arousal versus the negative emotional attractor is being in a sympathetic nervous system arousal called the stress response. It's thinking about your ideal, your personal vision versus how you're coming across, strengths versus weaknesses, focusing on the future versus the past, hope versus fear, possibilities versus problems, optimism versus pessimism, and learning agendas, something you would love to try versus performance improvement plans, something you think you should do, like a New Year's Eve resolution. So here are some quick thoughts. If we go back to this model, you can see how I basically contend that two things. You need both the positive and negative emotional attractor. You cannot change in a sustainable way without both of them being present. Your body would die if either one of these systems weren't present. But I would contend that most of the time when people start a sustained desired change, they start in the positive emotional attractor. Why? Because the negative emotional attractor is depressing. And, as I'm about to show you, it leads to cognitive impairment. The positive emotional attractor leads to opening up of neural circuits, possibility of growing new neural tissue, and the possibility of more perceptual and emotional openness. So I believe that they tend to start in the positive emotional attractor. But you have to go into the negative emotional attractor. But you don't go in even amounts of time. You spend time around the positive emotional attractor, which is technically a Lorenz strange attractor, rotating around it, getting open, and then you go into the negative attractor for a little bit of stress adaptation, and you go back to the positive emotional attractor. And then after a while, you get opened up again, and you go back to the negative emotional attractor for some stimulation, some stress, then you go back to the positive emotional attractor. So if you're following my cursor, you're realizing that you're spending a lot more time in the positive emotional attractor. Could be as much as a 3-to-1 ratio is proposed by Barb Fredrickson and Marcel Losada in talking about effective teams. John Gottman in Stable Loving Marriages claims there's a 5-to-1 ratio. I don't know what that ratio is for you, but I can tell you that it's probably most of the time between 3 and 6 to 1. Why? Because we always think about what's worse. That's how we're socialized. We have to defend our organisms. Ecologically, we're not going to survive unless we defend against threats. But the problem is, as I'm about to show you, that when you go into the stress syndrome, the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, one of the things that happens is through literally milliseconds and then a second or two, a whole set of not only parts of your neural circuitry,
Richard, are you still there? Folks, it seems like we might have just lost Richard. Give me just a moment and we'll try to get him on the phone.
and in doing that, the blood away from capillaries in the brain, not just in other parts of the body, not just your fingertips and your nose and your ears, which tend to get cold when you're under chronic stress. Now, by the way, this kind of stress I'm talking about is not pulling your hair out acute stress. I'm talking about annoying stress. You know, your computer doesn't boot up right. Your cell phone drops a call. Somebody cuts you off in traffic. It is the buildup of those every day which are the nastiest. Called neurogenesis. There are plenty of studies showing that when you're under this chronic stress, which is called allostatic load or strain, that your field of vision, peripheral vision for most of us is about 180 to 270 degrees. It drops down to 30 degrees under chronic stress. But similarly, we close down to new ideas. We close down to thinking of alternatives. We close down to other people who are different than we are or scare us. We close down to other feelings. We close down. That's what happens when people try to help you focus on your weaknesses. That's the negative emotional attractor. In contrast, the system, which I'm characterizing here as you think of through compassion, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Oxytocin and vasopressin, oxytocin primarily in women, vasopressin primarily in men. These are vasodilators that open up your blood vessels, so all of a sudden your pulse rate and your blood pressure start to drop. Your immune system clicks in. It is under this parasympathetic nervous system state that you actually are cognitively at your best. So the dilemma or the opportunity that we have is that if we are an effective leader, if we are in resonant relationships, over time the stress of that will become non-sustainable. We will become non-sustainable unless we go through moments of renewal on a regular basis. It turns out that 4 of the experiences that produce more resonant relationships are also ones that medical research has been shown recently in the last 10 to 20 years, produce this renewing process in the body, this arousal of the parasympathetic nervous system, what I'm calling the positive emotional attractor. Practicing meditating, yoga, Tai Chi work, prayer works if it's to a loving God. Physical exercise in moderation, where you're tuning into the present works. Helping others who are less fortunate, having a loving relationship, having pets like dogs and cats, horses that you can stroke, monkeys, really helps. Feeling hopeful and positive about the future helps. And the one that we did not feature in our 2005 book, that the data are now out clearly enough to suggest that it really works, is laughter, joy, and playfulness. So part of what you're noticing in this chart is that if we are to keep ourselves sustainable, we have to dose ourselves regularly with renewal. If we are to help other people create an environment in which we can think adaptively and openly, we need to emphasize the positive emotional attractor, not to the exclusion of the negative emotional attractor. We need both, but as an alternating, compensating experience. How do we know? Again, we have a whole series of various studies. I'm going to go very quickly over just a few of them. One was an fMRI study we did where we had two 30-minute coaching sessions, one to the positive emotional attractor, one to the negative. And these were with 20-year-old sophomores. And the positive attractor was tell me what your ideal life would be like 10 years from now. The negative emotional attractor wasn't all that negative. It said tell me about how you're doing in your courses, are you doing all your homework, are you doing all the readings, are you getting enough time from your instructor? Not really negative, but ones that make you feel slightly guilty. Well, we found 25 different places under a fixed effects analysis that were very strongly differentiated. So, for example, the anterior cingulate cortex, the ECC, and the medial prefrontal cortex, parts of your brain where you become very self-conscious, you become conflicted about feelings of guilt or tension. We're very aroused with the negative emotional attractor. Meanwhile, the orbitofrontal cortex nucleus accumbens were very aroused with the positive emotional attractor. The visual cortex, the part of was aroused with the positive emotional attractor, where you activate the thoughts of imagination. We have 24, like I said, longitudinal studies at Weatherhead. We're showing dramatic increases in emotional and social intelligence behavior. This is not for questionnaires. These are actually all coded behavior from work samples or videotape simulations. And why is this so impressive? Because most above average MBA programs have a 2% impact and then it drops off. The Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence has shown us that in industry and government, even the best published studies have shown 11% impact and then it drops off. So it shows these results. And the major thing we're doing in this course that introduces this, the lead course we call it at Weatherhead, is we get people to write a personal vision, and we have a lot of coaching about their vision. Wasid Khawaja did a masterful doctoral thesis. He's now on the faculty at the University of Manitoba in the medical school, but he did it here looking at the role of positive and negative emotional attractor in the experience in the doctor-patient relationship and how it affects type 2 diabetes. It's well documented that treatment adherence, people taking their medicine and watching their diet, of type 2 diabetics worldwide is 50%. That's why the cost of health care is skyrocketing. Wasid was able to show that the PEA to NEA ratio, as experienced by the patient, mediated and therefore had the most powerful predicting effect on treatment adherence than all of the other or most of the other variables used to describe doctor-patient relationships. So, if I can try to narrow it down and then open it up to questions, this is really at the heart of what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that if we really would like to maximize the development of others, renewal of both others and ourselves, and creating a more positive emotional attractor climate, we need to have more conversations that inspire us. And these conversations can be over lunch, they can be formal coaching sessions, they can be chats over coffee. But they tend to be around things like these four. Talking about your dreams of an ideal life. Talking about your values or virtues. Things that these first two that really identify and arouse hope and mindfulness. Thinking about people who helped you become or get to where you are. Gratitude, which is at the heart of compassion. And also some more of hope, sometimes playing games like a bucket list, or if you won $50 million after tax on the lottery, how would your work or life change? And I would suggest that coming out of this webinar, you actually do an assignment that somewhere over the next week, find 2 outstanding performers. They don't have to be subordinates. They could be peers, could be a spouse, but they have to be outstanding, because you should have no sense that you want to help them or fix them. All you're trying to do is have a conversation with them. And I'll call this conversation coaching with compassion. But I'm saying sit down with them, whether over a meal or a long cup of coffee, and talk for about an hour and see if you can practice bringing them into this positive emotional attractor and keeping them there. You're not doing the whole coaching thing. You're just trying to practice what's it like to help somebody into the positive emotional attractor. And you should be prepared with a few of these questions. Don't try to help them fix anything, and be ready to be mutual. So before I go into my closing thoughts, why don't I open it up for questions? And Ashley, maybe you can help me with this.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for such a great presentation, which I know was both stimulating and enriching. I have a question to get us started off with, and that's, do you think that as a manager or supervisor, there's an obligation to institute opportunities for renewal for their followers? And by that, I mean you institute opportunities for followers to renew themselves?
Definitely. Well, actually, I shouldn't say definitely. Let me be more realistic and balanced about this. If you're really trying to maximize performance and use up your human talent, if you're really focused on performance and you don't care whether or not the people are alive year after next, or you don't care if they're excited about work or even willing to bring their full game, then I would say, yeah, don't worry about it. Maximize performance, use what I would call a human resource liquidation strategy. Burn them up. So obviously I'm being facetious. So I think, yes, I think each one of us, if you care about the sustainability, look, how many of us would still be left in a position, for-profit or not-for-profit, if we said, we're going to maximize the return we have this year, and who cares about whether or not there's any asset level next year? You'd be fired, or you'd be in jail, or you'd get an exception from the government so you wouldn't have to go to jail, and you just get a double-dip pension or something. But at any rate, what basically happens is, if we don't do this, the human capital in the organization will atrophy. So if we don't help people renew, we're going to have less of people available to be innovative, to think, to serve customers the next month, the next year. So I think we both owe it to the humans that we work with, but we also owe it to the organizational stakeholders.
Great. Thank you. Judson wonders what kinds of research opportunities you see for exploring specific practices that encourage focus on the positive emotional attractor.
Immense. I mean, right now I'm either advising at a distance through email doctoral students in various countries around the world, or working with them right here. But it goes in the full range, from doctor-patient relationships, nurse-patient relationships, doctor-nurse relationships in healthcare, where I know folks trying to work some of these ideas and include it in their research on pain management, on cancer treatment, continuing on type 2 diabetes. I've also been in conversations with folks trying to do this in nursing schools and medical schools and dental schools. I'm going to be meeting in about 15 minutes with a doctoral student doing a study about this and the relationship between dentists and their patients. So in the healthcare fields, this is very popular right now because it's a very efficacious issue. Somebody pointed out at a recent consortium meeting that 92% of actual medical malpractice never gets reported. But of all the cases that get reported, 80% of them have to do with a breakdown in the relationship and the communication between the doctor and the patient, and that results in a malpractice case being brought in. Very often, people have shown that those people that demonstrate regularly, those doctors that demonstrate regularly lower emotional and social intelligence, as seen by others, are the ones who have the statistically significant, much higher rate of people filing medical malpractice against them. So I would contend it's not just an issue of better health care, it's also an issue of managing healthcare costs. In universities, right now a really hot issue is how do we help freshmen not be so depressed? In the United States, a report just came out a couple months ago showing current freshmen were more depressed than their counterparts for the past 50 years. The emotional trauma that's going on has a lot of different things going on, but part of it is we have to worry about that, because when somebody is depressed, they're not able to hold on to things that they're doing in class or even answers they give on a test. So it's a major issue in learning retention and learning effectiveness for all of us in education. Management. Right now, an awful lot of organizations have to be adapting very fast to stay abreast of the unbelievably fast-changing markets, technology, cost structures, availability of capital. This adaptability doesn't come easily. It comes from people who are feeling more open-minded, are seeing possibilities. So I would say in many, many different fields, the desire to create more positive emotional attractor is really there. And people right now are doing everything from qualitative to quantitative research, trying to discover techniques going on, as well as testing the significance of everything from, you know, how do you use more compassion, how do you use more optimism, how do you use more playfulness and humor.
Great, thank you. We have time for about one or two more questions. The next one is from Andrew, who says that typically in his organization, when they are debriefing a 360 survey with a manager, they tend to focus on the gaps, their weaknesses, and then build a development plan around the priority weaknesses. He's wondering what you would suggest instead or to augment this process.
Yes, I think that if you only focus on the weaknesses and you focus on a plan to compensate or rehab the person, that you basically are trying to get them out. That when you engender that degree of guilt or obligation, people go into a stress reaction and start to close down. You might get their attention, and you might need it that way to wake somebody up, but it won't help them change. If you really want the person to change, what you have to do is start in the positive emotional attractor. Start with their dreams. Start with their visions. Start with their value. If they can go into that and they can start to develop their personal vision and what they would love to be doing, you then have the opening to help the person by just saying, okay, what strengths do you have that will help you get there? What weaknesses might get in the way? My experience is that most people, the vast majority of people, actually give you the answers. And by them coming up with it in that sequence, you are more likely to not have to convince them. See, what you need to do is stay away from trying to tell somebody what they're supposed to do, because that makes people feel guilty. It makes them feel like an obligation, and that puts them into a defensive position. Like I said, sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes you have to make people defensive because they're not performing, and you want to set the stage for letting them go, firing them. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. But I'm saying don't confuse revenge or retribution or documenting the case for human resources with trying to encourage somebody to emerge, to develop, to get re-excited about growth.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Is that another question, Ashley?
Yeah, I actually, since we're drawing to a close on time, I want to be respectful of everyone. I'd like to close just by sharing an observation from one of our participants who shared, and this is Kurt, he shared that it sounds like strategies are so much less important than positive relationships.
I'm sorry, you blocked out on it. Did you say that strategies are less important than relationships?
Than positive relationships. That's one of his takeaways from this webinar. What do you think about that?
Well, if by strategies you mean business or organizational strategies, I'd say no, not exactly. Well, it depends on what you're doing. But if what you mean by that is what accounts for the most variance in a leader's effectiveness, I would contend it is the degree of these positive relationships. Because even in the realm of strategies, no one individual comes up with all the ideas. Believe me, Steve Jobs did not come up with the idea of the iPad. Somebody in his organization thought it up. So the question is, how do you create the environment in which people come up with these ideas and then bring them to you? How do you create an environment where somebody else picks up on the idea and figures out how to make it happen? So coming up with the strategic key issue is not as important as inspiring others to be considering it. That said, once you have those ideas, somebody does have to help focus. So in that sense, strategy is important. I do think in most organizations the real momentum for change occurs through swarming. But at some point you need to lay out a plan and you have to say, well, where are we going to invest our resources? So it's not really an either or, it's an issue of which comes first. And in that case, I think I agree with Kurt's takeaway that I think the positive relationships open up more possibilities.
Okay, great. At this time, I'd like to bring a close to questions. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for such a great presentation.
Could I make a closing comment?
Yeah, please.
I think we have an obligation to try to live the lives that we dream of. This isn't a dress rehearsal. And I think what that means is that we need to really spend time thinking of how we will feel excited about life. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. How do we make sure that when people walk away from this, on the whole, they feel excited and challenged about the next thing they're going to do? And I think we owe it to ourselves not to waste this gift from God of life, not to waste this opportunity, because most of the people in the world don't have the opportunities we do, those of us on this webinar, to affect the conditions of our lives. We owe it to them not to waste it. And I think one of the ways not to waste it is to keep yourself excited. And one way to do that is remember what it felt like. Remember when you were a kid before your birthday or a holiday. Remember the night of your first date, how you felt after your first kiss, at the time of the birth of your first child, publication of your first paper, launching of your first IPO, getting your first patent. These are phenomenal moments in our lives. And if you start to remember that, you will be in the renewal zone. You will be excited about this. And because of emotional contagion, the people around you will start to get infected with it. And they will start to feel it. And you'll show that people together in your families, in your communities, and at work, together are able to do things you never thought before were possible. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Richard. I think that's a great note on which to end. At this point, I'd like to announce the winners of the book giveaway. 4 of today's participants were randomly selected to receive a copy of Resonant Leadership, written by our very own presenter, Richard Boyatzis. Those winners are Alan B. from Massachusetts, Yvonne M. from Wyoming, Robert F. from Virginia, and Cheryl L. from Ontario. Congratulations to those. I'll be sending you an email shortly with more details. If you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you will be able to join us for future installments of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series. Please visit www.ila-net.org/webinars for more information on upcoming webinars. Thank you so much for joining. Be well and do good work.